The late August heat hung over Chicago like a heavy blanket, pressing against the glass walls of the University Medical Center. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed softly above sterile white halls, with a faint scent of antiseptic clung to every surface. Dr. Ethan Blake walked slowly down the corridor, his lab coat hanging loosely from his shoulders, the weight of the last few days etched deep into his face. He had been a surgeon for more than a decade, long enough to know that not every life could be saved. But this time was different. This time, they were calling him a killer. The parents of 13-year-old Angelina Parker were threatening to sue the hospital, convinced that Ethan was responsible for their daughter's death. Her mother's screams still echoed in his ears. "You killed her! You killed my baby!" A chorus of grief and rage that no amount of reasoning could silence. The father had tried to calm her, had even told Ethan he knew the risks, but none of that mattered now. Their little girl was gone, and in the eyes of the law, someone had to pay. The truth was more complicated, as it always is. The decision to operate on Angelina had not been Ethan's. It had been made by Dr. Nathan Blake, the ambitious young surgeon who happened to be the chief of surgery's son. Nathan had recently returned from a residency in London and carried himself with the kind of arrogance that came from privilege and unchecked confidence. The case was a desperate one, a congenital defect so severe that most children with it didn't live past infancy. Angelina had survived to 13, but her condition had deteriorated rapidly. The best surgeons in the country had refused to operate, calling it a lost cause. Nathan, eager to prove himself, saw it differently. He wanted the glory. He wanted to succeed where others had refused. Ethan had tried to warn him. In the staff room behind a half-closed door, he had overheard Nathan dismissing concerns from other doctors, boasting that he had observed similar procedures during his time abroad. Ethan had shaken his head silently. With the equipment they had, and in the condition Angelina was in, the surgery was almost certain to fail. But Nathan didn't want advice, especially not from someone he saw as part of the old guard. Then, on the morning of the operation, Nathan simply didn't show up. No explanation, no call, just vanished. The department head, his father, cornered Ethan in the hallway. "You'll have to step in," he said, as if it were a minor inconvenience. Ethan hesitated. "What's on the schedule?" "Just Angelina Parker," the older man replied. Ethan froze. "No, I won't do it. She'll die on the table. You know she will." But then Angelina's father appeared, his eyes red and desperate. "Please," he begged. "We know the risks, but if there's even the slightest chance, even one more week with her, we'll take it. She wants to fight. Please don't give up on her." Ethan's resolve began to waver, against his better judgment, and with the signatures of the parents on the consent forms he scrubbed in. The surgery went as expected, which is to say it went badly. Angelina's frail body couldn't endure the strain. Despite every precaution, every carefully measured decision, she slipped away less than an hour after the final suture was placed. Ethan stepped into the waiting room with hollow eyes and told the family what they already feared, that their daughter was gone. Her mother collapsed, screaming at him through her tears. Her father argued with her, saying they had known the risks, but her grief was louder than reason. And when she vowed to see Ethan behind bars, he didn't have the strength to argue. That night, Ethan walked out of the hospital long after the sun had set. The sky above the city painted in muted orange and violet. The hum of traffic and the distant wail of sirens felt strangely far away, as if the world had moved on without him. He was only 35, but he felt 100. He had no one waiting for him at home. Once there had been someone, a wife he had loved deeply, but their marriage had collapsed under the weight of resentment and unspoken disappointments. She had dreamed of becoming an actress in New York, and motherhood, she said, would ruin her figure. When she became pregnant, she chose her career over their child and over him. That was the day something inside Ethan broke. Now his house was silent but for the soft padding of paws on the floor. "Tanya!" A scrappy little dog he had found abandoned by a dumpster one rainy evening was his only companion. He had named her, perhaps masochistically, after his ex-wife. She greeted him each night with unfiltered joy, oblivious to the wreckage inside him. Ethan sank into his couch, the room dark but for the flicker of passing headlights outside. His hands, so steady in the operating room, trembled as he stared at them. Somewhere, a family was mourning their daughter. Somewhere, a mother was whispering his name with hatred. And somewhere deep inside, he wondered if they were right. The afternoon sun had started to dip, but the heat still clung to the streets of Chicago like a second skin. The hum of traffic floated up from below as Dr. Ethan Blake crossed the bridge over the Chicago River, his thoughts still tangled in the chaos of the hospital. Angelina's mother's words echoed in his head with every step. Murderer. Killer. He told himself to breathe, to let the day go, but the guilt sat on his chest like a weight that refused to shift. Then movement on the far side of the bridge caught his eye. At first he thought it was a photo shoot. A young woman in a wedding dress, lace billowing in the warm wind. But there was no photographer, no groom, no wedding party. She was alone, and she was climbing the railing. "Hey!" Ethan called, breaking into a run. But before he could reach her, the woman swung a leg over the side, then the other, and with a sudden, desperate motion, she jumped. The splash hit the silence like an explosion. For a fraction of a second, Ethan froze, watching white fabric swirl in the dark water below. Then instinct took over. He dropped his bag, kicked off his shoes, and vaulted over the railing. The impact with the river was harder than he expected, a cold slap against the heavy summer air. He surfaced, gasping, and scanned the water. There, the white dress floated just beneath the surface, dragged down by its weight. He swam hard toward it, the current tugging at his arms. When he reached her, he hooked his arm under her shoulders and kicked toward the shore, lungs burning. "Stay with me," he muttered, though her eyes were closed and her body limp. By the time he dragged her onto the muddy embankment, his muscles were screaming. He checked her airway, still breathing. Faint, but there. He tilted her chin and gave 2 quick breaths. Water sputtered from her lips, and she coughed weakly, a sound that filled him with relief. "Can you hear me?" Ethan asked. Her eyelids fluttered, but her gaze was vacant, unfocused, as if she was somewhere far away. "It's okay. You're safe now." Her dress was soaked and filthy, her hair tangled and heavy with river water. The scent of alcohol wasn't there. Instead, her breath was strangely clean, her pupils unfocused. It wasn't drunkenness, Ethan thought. Something else was wrong. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked gently. She shook her head and began to cry, soft, broken sobs that cut deeper than any words. "Okay," Ethan said quietly. "Then I'll take you home." The taxi driver barely blinked when he saw the dripping bride at Ethan's side. Chicago had seen stranger things. Back at his small apartment, Ethan handed her a towel, found an oversized t-shirt and sweatpants, and showed her the bathroom. When she emerged, her steps were unsteady, her eyes glassy. He guided her to the couch and draped a blanket over her. She mumbled something incoherent before slipping into a deep, heavy sleep. It was only then, as he pulled the blanket up to her shoulders, that he noticed a thin scar on her knee, a neat, surgical line. Ethan frowned. He knew that scar. He had stitched it himself almost a year ago on a patient who'd been brought in by a group of bikers, a nameless girl from the streets, injured and alone. He stared at her sleeping face now, trying to reconcile the memory with the woman before him. Not a runaway in torn jeans, but a bride in silk and lace. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds, but the woman on his couch was no better. Her speech was slurred, her thoughts scattered, her movements slow and mechanical. This wasn't a hangover. Ethan's instinct screamed that something deeper was wrong. "You're coming with me," he said gently. She didn't argue. At the hospital, a battery of tests confirmed his suspicion. There was no sign of alcohol or head trauma, but her blood work showed dangerously high levels of psychotropic medication, far beyond any therapeutic dose. It was enough to disrupt her motor function, her memory, even her will. Ethan stared at the report in silence. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't some misguided attempt at self-medication. Someone had drugged her, and they had done it deliberately. He looked at her again, lying unconscious on the gurney, her wedding dress folded neatly in a bag beside her. The nameless street girl from a year ago and this mysterious bride were one and the same. And somehow, her story had collided with his again. He felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt since Angelina, a sense of responsibility, of purpose. He had pulled this woman back from the edge once. Maybe fate was telling him he wasn't done yet. "Hang on," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I'm not letting you fall again." The steady beep of the cardiac monitor filled the small hospital room as the woman stirred beneath the thin, white blanket. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened fully, revealing wide, confused eyes. For a moment, she stared at the ceiling as though trying to remember where she was. Then her gaze shifted, landing on the man standing quietly near the foot of her bed. "Good morning," Dr. Ethan Blake said gently, his tone steady and calm. "You're at Chicago University Medical Center. You were brought here after a fall into the river. How are you feeling?" Her voice was hoarse when she answered, "Like my head's full of fog, and everything feels blurry." "That's to be expected," Ethan said. "You had high levels of psychotropic medication in your system. Do you remember taking anything? Pills? Alcohol?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't drink. I can't. And I didn't take anything." "What's your name?" Ethan asked. "Elise," she whispered. "Elise Walker. I'm 26. The name settled into the sterile air between them. Elise Walker. The woman in the wedding dress finally had a name. Ethan nodded encouragingly. "Do you remember what happened before you ended up in the water?" Her brow furrowed as she pieced the fragments together. "There was a wedding. Mine. I married Daniel Walker. And then I started feeling strange. Weak. My thoughts didn't make sense. Daniel said it was probably exhaustion. He took me to the river, said the fresh air would help. Then he asked me if I loved him. He told me if I did, I should prove it. And then I was running. Someone was chasing me. After that, everything goes dark." Ethan's jaw tightened. It was too early to jump to conclusions, but the story didn't sit right. "Did Daniel give you anything to eat or drink before you started feeling this way?" Elise thought hard, then nodded. "Juice. Some salad. That's all. Nothing else." "No," she said firmly. "I swear." Ethan made a note in her chart, but the unease in his chest grew heavier. Over the next few days, as the drugs slowly cleared from her system, Elise began to talk more, and with each conversation her story unfolded like a bruised flower opening in slow motion. She had grown up in the foster system, a forgotten child passed from one indifferent home to another. "We fought like wolves in that place," she said one afternoon as Ethan checked her vitals. "It wasn't about being mean. It was survival. If you didn't fight, you got eaten alive." As a teenager, she aged out of the system with nothing but a trash bag of clothes and a heart full of rage. She took any job she could find, waitress, cleaner, janitor, and everyone ended the same way. "People think they can talk to you like trash because you're nobody," she said bitterly. And I wasn't the type to smile and nod. If someone disrespected me, I hit back. Literally. One night changed everything. She was walking home when she saw two men beating an older man outside a convenience store. "I didn't even think," she recalled. "I just jumped in. They ran, eventually. He was bruised and bleeding, but alive." The man she had saved turned out to be Harold Walker, a wealthy businessman with no heirs. He was lonely and stubborn, and for reasons she never fully understood, he took her under his wing. "He called me his daughter," Elise said, her voice softening. He taught me how to run a company, how to stand in a boardroom and not flinch. He said I had a good head and a stronger heart. When he was dying of cancer, he left everything to me. The company, the estate, all of it. It was after Harold's death that Daniel entered her life, Harold's only nephew. He told me he didn't care about the money or the company, Elise said. He said he loved me for who I was, and I believed him. They married quickly, too quickly, perhaps, and almost immediately after the wedding, things began to change. Elise experienced sudden memory lapses, confusion, and bursts of paranoia. Daniel insisted she see a psychiatrist. The doctor diagnosed her with schizophrenia, a diagnosis that was never confirmed by further testing. It didn't feel real, Elise said, twisting the hospital blanket in her hands. I felt like I was disappearing, like someone else was taking over my life. Ethan listened quietly, his expression grave. Everything about the story felt wrong. Psychosis didn't appear overnight. It didn't vanish as the drugs left her system. And it certainly didn't line up with the toxicology report sitting on his clipboard. Elise, he said finally, I want you to be very careful. Don't eat or drink anything from Daniel. Not a sip of water. Not a bite of food. And if he brings you anything at all, save a sample and bring it to me. We'll test it. Her eyes widened. You think he's doing this to me? I think we don't know enough yet, Ethan replied carefully. But I've seen enough cases like this to know that sometimes the danger isn't in your head. It's standing right next to you. For a long moment, Elise said nothing. Then she nodded slowly. Okay, I'll do what you say. Ethan gave her a reassuring smile, but his mind was already racing. The scar on her knee, the drugs in her blood, the husband who wanted her declared insane. Too many pieces pointed to the same conclusion. And if he was right, Elise Walker's nightmare was just beginning. 3 days later, the steady rhythm of the hospital had returned. The same sterile halls, the same soft hum of machines. But something in the air around Elise Walker's room had shifted. She sat propped up against the bed's railing, her skin no longer pale and clammy, her thoughts clearer now that the drugs were nearly gone from her system. Ethan Blake stopped by every few hours, checking her vitals, adjusting her for and trying, unsuccessfully, to shake the knot of suspicion growing in his chest. That afternoon, a knock on the door broke the monotony. Daniel Walker stepped into the room, carrying a bouquet of pale pink roses. His eyes darted nervously from Elise to Ethan. There you are, he said with forced cheer. You scared me half to death. 1 minute you're next to me, the next you've vanished. Ethan watched him closely. She didn't just vanish, Mr. Walker. She jumped into a river. Daniel's smile faltered. I was calling an ambulance. She was acting strange, disoriented. I turned around and she was gone. I thought she'd gone for a walk. I never imagined, he trailed off, shaking his head as if the memory were too painful to finish. Elise stared down at the blanket in her lap. You didn't follow me, she said quietly. Daniel stepped closer. I didn't know where you went. I called and called. Elise, I was terrified. His words might have sounded convincing to someone else. But Ethan had seen too many desperate husbands in too many exam rooms to be fooled. Daniel's tone was rehearsed, his eyes too calculating. He left after a few minutes, promising to return the next day. And he did, this time with a thermos of herbal tea he swore would help Elise relax. Just a sip, Daniel urged. It's chamomile and lavender. You'll feel better. Elise hesitated. Ethan's warning echoed in her mind. But against her better judgment, she drank. The results were almost immediate. Within an hour, the fog began to creep back in. Her speech slowed, her thoughts tangled. By evening, she could barely form a coherent sentence. Ethan ordered another toxicology screen, and the results left no room for doubt. Her blood was once again saturated with high levels of psychotropic drugs, the same class of medication as before. When Ethan showed Elise the results the next morning, She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "It's him," she whispered. "It has to be." There was another revelation waiting. The latest blood work contained a second, unexpected result. "Elise," Ethan said gently, "you're pregnant." Her hand dropped to her abdomen as if trying to feel a heartbeat. Her face went white. "No, it's still early," he said softly. "A few weeks, maybe." Tears welled in her eyes. I can't have a child with someone who tried to poison me. What if he hurts the baby? What if," her voice cracked, "what if he only married me for this?" Ethan knelt beside her bed. "Listen to me. You are not alone in this. We'll get to the bottom of it, and we'll make sure you and your baby are safe." "How?" she whispered. "By proving what he's done. But we need evidence, and the best evidence is a confession." So they made a plan. Ethan would notify the hospital's legal team and discreetly alert the police. They would be present, out of sight, when Daniel came to visit again. Elise would act as if nothing had changed. 2 days later, Daniel arrived carrying another thermos. "I thought you could use more of that tea," he said, setting it on the bedside table. Elise glanced at it, but didn't touch it. "Daniel," she began carefully, "I've been thinking about what happened, about how I ended up in the river." He laughed nervously. "You were confused. It happens." "I don't think I was confused," she said. "I think someone gave me something." Something in Daniel's expression hardened. "Are you saying I did this?" "I don't know," Elise said softly. "Did you?" The silence stretched. Then Daniel scoffed. "You're imagining things again. You always do this. This is why the doctor said you need treatment. You're unstable, Elise. You always have been." Her hands clenched around the sheets. "I wasn't unstable before I met you." "You were always unstable," he shouted, the mask slipping. "I gave you those pills to calm you down because you were out of control. I was trying to help you." Ethan stepped forward from his position near the wall. "You gave her the drugs?" Daniel froze, realizing what he'd said. I didn't mean—" "You said it," Ethan cut him off. "You admitted it." Daniel's face flushed with anger. "So what? I'm her husband. I have a right to take care of her. And half of everything she owns is mine now. That's how marriage works." From the corner of the room, a voice spoke up. "Not when the marriage was built on a crime." Daniel turned. 2 uniformed officers stepped into view, their presence suddenly filling the room. "Daniel Walker," one of them said, "you're under arrest for administering controlled substances without consent and for attempted fraud." Daniel's jaw dropped. "You set me up," he spat. "No," Ethan said coldly. "You set yourself up." As they read Daniel his rights and snapped the cuffs around his wrists, Elise watched silently, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I want a divorce," she whispered as they led him away. "Right now. I never want to see him again." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then that's exactly what we'll make happen." The silence that followed Daniel's outburst was sharp enough to cut through the air. His words still hung there, raw and ugly. "Half of everything she owns is mine now. That's how marriage works." And then, before he could backtrack or reframe what he'd just admitted, a door at the far end of the room opened with a quiet click. 2 uniformed officers stepped in, followed by a plainclothes detective holding a small recording device. "We heard everything," the detective said calmly. "Every word." Daniel spun around, his face draining of color. "What the hell is this?" "Daniel Walker," the officer began, stepping forward. "You are under arrest for administering controlled substances without consent and for attempted fraud." Wait, you can't do this." Daniel stumbled backward, his voice rising. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just helping my wife. She's unstable. She needs medication." The detective held up the recorder. "You admitted to drugging her without her consent. That's a felony under Illinois law." The officers moved in. Daniel backed away until his legs hit the edge of the bed, and then there was nowhere left to go. Cold steel cuffs clicked around his wrists. "This is insane," he shouted, thrashing against their grip. "She's the crazy one, not me. She's the one who manipulated Harold into giving her everything. She's the thief, not me. She stole my inheritance." His voice grew louder, more desperate with each word, but the officers remained impassive. Ethan stood still, his expression unreadable, watching the man who had nearly destroyed Elise's life spiral deeper into panic. "She took everything," Daniel screamed as they dragged him toward the door. "The company, the estate, it should have been mine. All of it should have been mine." Elise sat frozen in her hospital bed, her hands gripping the sheets so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply stared at the man she had vowed to love and honor, now spitting hatred at her as he was led away in handcuffs. "Do you have anything you'd like to say before we go?" the detective asked, pausing at the doorway. Elise's voice was barely above a whisper, but every word was steady. "Yes," she said. "I want a divorce." Immediately, Daniel's head whipped around, his face twisted with rage. "You can't leave me," he snarled. "You need me. You're nothing without me." But Elise didn't respond. She just stared at him with an expression that wasn't anger or fear. It was something colder, something final. For the first time since the nightmare began, she had control. The door closed behind them, and the room fell quiet again. Elise exhaled shakily, pressing a trembling hand to her stomach. 2 weeks, she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. 2 weeks ago I was walking down the aisle, and now her voice broke, and tears she'd been holding back spilled freely down her cheeks. Ethan moved to her side and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I wish I could say something to make this easier, but I know words don't do much right now." Elise shook her head. "I was so sure he loved me. I believed every word. And now I'm carrying his child. How do I even begin to process that?" "One step at a time," Ethan replied. "The most important thing is that you and your baby are safe, and I'll help make sure it stays that way." Her eyes lifted to meet his. "Why are you doing this? You barely know me." Ethan hesitated, his gaze distant for a moment. "Because I've seen what it's like when no one is there to help. And because I believe you deserve better than what he tried to do to you." Something shifted in Elise's expression. A flicker of trust, faint but real. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Ethan said gently, "we focus on your recovery. The police will handle Daniel. A lawyer will help you start the divorce process, and I'll connect you with someone who specializes in protecting victims of domestic crimes. You're not alone in this." The words settled over her like a warm blanket. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, Elise allowed herself to breathe. The ache in her chest didn't vanish, but it dulled enough for her to feel the weight of exhaustion pressing down. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "You don't have to thank me. Just promise me you'll keep fighting, for yourself and for your child." She placed a hand over her stomach again, the faintest hint of determination in her voice. "I will," she said. "I don't know how yet, but I will." Outside, the late summer sun was beginning to dip, painting the city in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere across town, Daniel Walker sat in the back of a police cruiser, railing against the world as his carefully constructed plans crumbled around him. But in this quiet hospital room, Elise Walker was beginning something new, a journey not just toward justice, but toward reclaiming her life. And for Ethan, watching her take that first fragile step, the heaviness he'd carried since Angelina's death eased just a little. He couldn't save everyone, but maybe, just maybe, he could save her. The weeks that followed Daniel Walker's arrest passed slowly but steadily. The storm had begun to quiet. Elise remained in the hospital under observation, her strength returning a little more each day. She was still fragile, physically, emotionally, but the heavy fog that had once clouded her thoughts was gone. The medication was clearing from her system, and her memory was sharper now. She could finally look toward the future without the dizzying disorientation that had haunted her since her wedding day. Ethan Blake visited often, sometimes with test results, sometimes just to talk. They spoke about the baby, about her fears and hopes. They spoke about the lawsuit she planned to file against Daniel. And sometimes when the sun dipped low and the hospital halls were quiet, they spoke about pain, the kind that lingers long after wounds should have healed. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that something stirred in Ethan, a question he had buried years ago but could no longer ignore. Elise had mentioned bits of her childhood in the foster system, memories of group homes, of names on files she was never allowed to see, of the vague story she had been told about her biological parents. It had been simple. Her mother died young, her father was gone, and there were no known relatives. That was all she knew. Something about that story scratched at the back of Ethan's mind. It was too familiar. A few nights later, long after his shift ended, he sat in the archives room of the hospital's research library, sifting through old records and databases. What started as idle curiosity became an obsession. He requested his own sealed birth records, something he hadn't dared to do before. When the envelope arrived, heavy with official stamps and brittle photocopies, he opened it with shaking hands. The file was sparse but devastating. His biological father, a man he had no memory of, had been convicted of armed robbery and manslaughter. He died in prison before Ethan turned 2. His mother, unable to support him, had lost custody shortly after. Ethan had been adopted by a distant cousin, a couple who raised him as their own and never spoke about the past. But one line at the bottom of the report stopped him cold. Mother gave birth to a second child, female, 2 years after the termination of parental rights. Child placed in state custody. Location undisclosed. For hours he stared at those words, reading them again and again. A second child, a little girl, a sister he had never known. He requested access to old state adoption records. It took days of bureaucratic hurdles, calls to social services, and favors from colleagues. But eventually the truth emerged. The little girl born to his biological mother had entered the foster system under the name Baby Jane Doe. At age 3, she was renamed Elise. Elise Walker. Ethan's breath caught in his chest. It felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. Elise, the woman he had pulled from a river, the woman whose life he had saved twice now, was his sister, his family. He didn't tell her right away. How could he? The revelation was too heavy, too enormous. He double-checked every document, every date, every line of information until there was no doubt left. And then, one quiet afternoon, he walked into her room with the envelope clutched in his hand. "Elise," he said softly, pulling a chair to her bedside. "There's something I need to talk to you about. Something important." Her brows knit in confusion. "You're scaring me. What is it?" He took a deep breath. "I've been looking into my past. My biological parents. I never knew much about them. But I found out that my mother, she had another child. A daughter. 2 years after I was taken away." Elise blinked, unsure where he was going with this. "Okay, that daughter was placed into foster care. Her name was changed. She was adopted by the state." Ethan's voice trembled as he spoke the next words. Her name was Elise Walker. Silence. At first, Elise laughed, a nervous, disbelieving sound. "That's not possible," she whispered. "It can't be." But then Ethan showed her the records, the birth dates, the locations, the adoption files. As she read, the color drained from her face. "Oh my God," she breathed, her hands shaking. "You're saying we're brother and sister," Ethan finished softly. "I think we always were." The tears came slowly at first, then all at once. Elise pressed her hands to her face and sobbed. Not the sharp, bitter sobs of grief, but the kind that come when a missing piece of your soul is suddenly returned to you. Ethan reached for her, and she fell into his arms without hesitation. "I thought I was alone," she whispered into his shoulder. All these years I thought I had no one. You were never alone, he said, his own voice breaking. We just hadn't found each other yet. They held each other for a long time, the beeping machines and distant hospital noises fading into nothing. In that sterile room, something sacred had taken root, not just blood but belonging. The woman he had saved from the water, the patient whose life he had fought to protect, was his sister. And she was no longer just someone he was helping. She was family. When they finally pulled apart, their eyes were red, but their smiles were genuine. "Promise me," Elise said, her voice still trembling. "Promise me we'll never disappear from each other again." "Never," Ethan said. "Not for a single day." In that moment, the weight of the past, his failures, her loneliness, their fractured histories, began to lift. What had started as a chance encounter on a bridge had become something infinitely deeper. Fate hadn't just crossed their paths. It had reunited them. Autumn settled gently over Chicago, softening the sharp edges of the city with golden light and crisp air. Months had passed since Daniel's arrest, and the chaos that had once defined Elise Walker's life had slowly begun to recede. Her days were now marked not by fear or confusion, but by quiet routines and small, steady joys. The pregnancy that had once terrified her became something else entirely, a source of purpose, even healing. She attended prenatal appointments with meticulous care, took long walks by the river, and read every book she could find about motherhood. The shadow of betrayal still lingered, but it no longer defined her. What had once been a reminder of pain had become, against all odds, a promise of new beginnings. Ethan Blake remained by her side through it all. He had helped her find a lawyer to begin divorce proceedings and arranged consultations with specialists to ensure the baby's health. But more than that, he simply showed up. He stopped by with takeout on nights she was too tired to cook, drove her to appointments when the nausea was too much to handle, and never once let her forget that she was not alone. It was during one of those routine checkups that Lauren Kim stepped into the picture in a way neither of them had expected. Lauren had been part of the hospital team since Elise's admission. Calm, steady, always with a reassuring word when things felt overwhelming. Ethan had known her for years, but somewhere in those long weeks of late-night shifts and quiet conversations by Elise's bedside, something between them shifted. Lauren would stop by Elise's room even when she wasn't assigned there, bringing herbal tea or fussing over the fetal heart monitor readings. "She's not just your patient," Lauren teased Ethan once, nudging his shoulder. "She's your sister, and that makes her my friend." It was Elise, of course, who noticed first. "You like her," she said one afternoon as Ethan helped her adjust the blanket over her legs. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "No, she makes you smile," Elise interrupted with a knowing grin. "And I haven't seen you smile like that in a very long time." He tried to deflect, but Elise wasn't letting it go. "Ask her out," she urged. "You've spent so much of your life saving everyone else, Ethan. Maybe it's time you let someone save you for a change." It took him a week, but he did it. He asked Lauren to dinner after one of their shifts. She said yes without hesitation. What started as cautious steps quickly became something real. Their first date turned into a second, then a third. They discovered shared passions, a love for old jazz records, an obsession with obscure documentaries, a mutual habit of watching thunderstorms from the safety of a cafe window. Ethan, who had spent so many years locked inside his own guilt and solitude, found himself laughing more, sleeping better, hoping again. And Lauren, who had built walls of her own after a painful divorce, found herself lowering them piece by piece. "You make it feel safe to start over," she told him one night as they walked along the river, the city lights shimmering on the water. They made Elise part of their new rhythm, too. On weekends, the three of them would explore the city, farmers markets, art fairs, quiet coffee shops tucked into side streets. They turned ordinary afternoons into small celebrations, each outing a reminder that family was not just something you were born into, but something you built. Elise, growing heavier with each passing week, would laugh as Ethan insisted on carrying every bag, while Lauren snapped photos of her baby bump against murals and autumn leaves. It was during one of those weekends, as they sat together on a park bench watching the river flow beneath a canopy of amber leaves, that Ethan knew Lauren was no longer just someone he cared for. She was the future he wanted. A month later, he invited her to dinner at the little Italian place near the hospital where they'd had their first date. As dessert arrived, he slid a small velvet box across the table. Lauren stared at it, then at him, eyes wide. "Lauren," he said, his voice unsteady but sure, "these past months have shown me something I'd forgotten. That life doesn't end when it breaks. It begins again. And I want to begin again with you. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, then laughed through her tears. "Yes, of course." They shared the news with Elise that night. She burst into happy tears, hugging them both with surprising strength for someone 7 months pregnant. "We're going to be a family," she said, smiling through her tears. "A real one." And they would be. Ethan and Lauren decided they would marry after Elise's baby was born, not because they needed to wait, but because they wanted Elise to stand beside them, not just as family, but as the reason their lives had been rewritten. The winter wind swept across the river as they left the restaurant hand in hand, but Ethan felt only warmth. The man who once believed he was defined by his failures was now building a future, not alone, but surrounded by the people he loved. And for the first time in a long time, he felt that everything broken in his life had finally begun to heal. The snow was falling softly over Chicago the night Elise went into labor, the city wrapped in winter's hush. Inside the hospital, fluorescent lights hummed and footsteps echoed as nurses hurried through the halls. Elise gripped the edge of the bed, her face pale but determined, as another wave of pain rolled through her. "It's time," she whispered, her breath catching. Ethan Blake was already in scrubs, his heart pounding harder than it ever had in an operating room. He had performed hundreds of surgeries in his career, but none like this. This wasn't just another patient. This was his sister, and the child about to enter the world was his nephew. Lauren stood beside Elise, holding her hand, whispering words of reassurance. "You're strong," she said. "You've got this." The labor was long and difficult. Hours stretched into an exhausting blur, and Elise's strength began to waver. Then the monitors began to beep erratically, and a nurse's urgent voice broke through the room. "She's hemorrhaging." Time shifted. Everything became movement and instinct. Ethan snapped into action, his voice steady and precise as he gave orders. "We need to prep her for an emergency C-section now. 2 units of O-negative on standby. Move." Elise's eyes fluttered open as they wheeled her toward the operating room. "Ethan," she murmured, fear in her voice. "I'm right here," he said, leaning close so she could hear him. "I'm not going anywhere." The next hour was a battle. Blood loss threatened to spiral out of control, and for one terrifying moment, the fetal heart monitor dipped too low. Ethan's hands worked with the precision of muscle memory. His mind split between surgeon and brother. He closed off the bleeding vessel, stabilized her vitals, and guided the team through every critical step. And then a cry, thin and fierce, cutting through the sterile air. The nurse held up a tiny, wriggling boy, his skin flushed, his lungs declaring his arrival with all the strength his little body could muster. "He's stable," she said, smiling behind her mask. Ethan's chest tightened. He had brought hundreds of babies into the world, but none had ever felt like this. This one was family. The surgery wasn't over. Elise was still losing blood, still hovering between safety and danger. Ethan focused harder than he ever had in his life. Every stitch was a promise, every movement a prayer. Not her. Not today. When it was done, when the bleeding stopped and her vitals steadied, Ethan allowed himself to exhale. Elise was alive. So was her son. She woke hours later in recovery, her body weak, but her spirit intact. Lauren was sitting beside her, cradling a swaddled bundle in her arms. "He's beautiful," Lauren whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "Do you want to meet your son?" Elise's hands trembled as she took the baby into her arms. He was so small, so impossibly perfect, his tiny fingers curling instinctively around hers. "Hello," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's you. It's really you." Ethan entered the room quietly, still in his surgical cap, exhaustion etched into his face. Elise looked up at him through tears. "You saved us," she said. He shook his head. "We saved you. You did the hardest part." The attending OB approached with a gentle smile. "You're going to need time to heal," she said, "but the good news is there's no permanent damage. When you're ready, you'll be able to have more children if you choose." Elise nodded, her eyes never leaving her son's face. "I have everything I need right here," she whispered. The months that followed were a season of quiet miracles. Elise named her son Noah, a name that meant rest and new beginning. Ethan and Lauren visited daily, helping with feedings, diaper changes, and the sleepless nights that came with a newborn. Elise had worried she would feel alone as a single mother, but she never did. There was always someone beside her, a brother who had once been a stranger, a woman who was about to become her sister-in-law, and a tiny boy who had turned her world upside down in the best possible way. Their bond deepened beyond anything biology could define. Sunday dinners became a ritual, Ethan cooking while Lauren set the table, Elise rocking Noah by the fireplace. They laughed over burnt pasta, argued playfully over baby names for the future, and shared long conversations that lasted deep into the night. They were no longer broken pieces orbiting separate worlds. They were a family, forged not by blood or fortune, but by choice, trust, and love. One quiet evening, snow falling softly outside, Elise sat by the nursery window, cradling Noah as he drifted to sleep. She traced a finger along his cheek, marveling at how small he was, how fiercely she loved him. "All the darkness," she whispered to him. "Every night I thought would never end that led me here. To you." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but they weren't the bitter tears of the past. They were warm, full of gratitude. "We're safe now," she murmured. "All of us. And we'll never be alone again." From the doorway, Ethan and Lauren watched in silence, their hands intertwined. None of them spoke, but they didn't need to. The worst was behind them. Ahead lay a future they had built together, a future where pain had given way to hope, where broken lives had become whole. And in that small, softly lit room, as a mother held her son and a brother watched over them both, every wound that had once defined their lives finally began to heal.